Folks in southern Alabama always say the pines hold secrets deeper than a man's courage, and I came to believe it one sticky night last August, driving my old Ford pickup down a narrow dirt road outside Bruton after a long shift at the sawmill. The sun was gone, leaving just a streak of orange dying out behind the trees, and the cicadas were screaming so loud it felt like the woods themselves were alive. I'm 43, born and raised here, and I've spent more nights than I can count traveling back roads with nothing but moonlight for company. I've never been the type to scare easy, but that night the air seemed thick enough to choke on, and every shadow felt like it had eyes. Pine needles shifted and whispered over the roof of the truck, like something running just above me. The scent of hot sap, mixed with wet earth, rolled through the open window, making me tense without knowing why. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting headlights behind me. But the road stayed black and empty. Even my old engine sounded strange, like it was echoing off the trees too many times. My chest felt tight as I rounded a bend where the forest pressed in so close it blocked out the stars, leaving me in a tunnel of black. I've lived alone ever since my wife left 6 years ago. Just me and my hound dog, Rufus, in a small trailer tucked behind a stand of longleaf pines. I work steady hours and keep to myself, and folks around town call me reliable, if a bit quiet. I've always found comfort in routine. Coffee at dawn, 8 hours of work, and a cold beer on my porch once the sky goes dark. But even on my roughest days, I've never felt as uneasy as I did that night. There was a vibration running under my skin, like the woods themselves were waiting for me to slip up. I thought about stopping to stretch my legs, but the idea of stepping out into that blackness made my palms sweat. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel as the smell of something musky and sharp drifted in, heavy enough to make my eyes sting. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon rooting through leaves, but my gut refused to settle. It's strange how fast the familiar can turn on you out there in the dark. Half a mile later, I spotted something moving along the edge of the tree line, pacing me just beyond the reach of my headlights. It was low to the ground, but big enough to snap branches under its weight, and the eyeshine glowed greenish gold, like twin coins spinning in the dark. My first thought was cougar, though we don't see many around here. But the way it slunk forward and stopped whenever I slowed the truck made the hair rise on my arms. It kept weaving side to side, like it was deciding whether to cross the road or keep following me. I cut the engine and sat there with the motor ticking in the silence, straining to hear anything but my own pulse roaring in my ears. I could swear the thing was breathing, this deep raspy sound that seemed too big for any ordinary cat. Branches creaked and snapped behind it as if something else even larger was moving back there. My eyes darted everywhere, trying to catch a clear look, but it never showed itself fully. For a moment, the forest seemed to lean closer, shadows melting into one solid wall of black. Then, clear as day, it stepped forward just enough for me to see the outline of tufted ears and a short tail, and I realized it was a massive bobcat, bigger than any I'd seen before. I let out a shaky laugh, trying to calm the pounding in my chest, telling myself it was only a wildcat being territorial. But as soon as I blinked, it vanished behind a thick pine, and the strange breathing kept going, echoing around the trees like a distant drum. That was when I noticed the shadows spilling farther into the road, stretching in unnatural ways, and the musky smell grew so sharp it turned my stomach. I started the engine again, deciding I'd had enough of figuring out whether that cat was alone or if something else was lurking deeper in the dark. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to glance in the mirror as I drove off, feeling like something was keeping pace just out of sight. My pulse didn't settle until the lights of Bruton showed between the trees. I tell folks it was just a bobcat, and maybe that's true, but sometimes I wonder if there was more than one set of eyes watching me out there. The way the breathing continued after the bobcat was gone, and how the shadows seemed to move on their own, still makes me question what else might be prowling those Alabama woods. I've been out on those roads hundreds of times since, and every time I pass that bend, I feel that same chill crawling up my spine. Folks around here love to talk about haunted hollows and creatures nobody's ever caught on camera. And though I'm not a man to believe in ghosts, I can't shake the feeling I wasn't alone that night. Nature has a way of reminding you how small you are, how quickly you can go from confident to terrified. Some things you see in the woods, you carry with you whether you want to or not. The next story I've got makes this one feel like a Sunday picnic. Just wait till you hear it. Back in the summer of 2011, down near Monroeville, I was working nights as a security guard at an old lumber yard that hadn't been busy in years, and it was during one of those shifts that I witnessed something that still crawls under my skin. The heat was relentless, even after dark, the kind that hangs over the ground and makes the blacktop shimmer under the yard lights. Crickets and frogs sang their overlapping symphony, and the air smelled of creosote and pine sap from stacks of unused lumber warping in the humidity. I'd grown used to walking the same patrol route, flashlight in hand, checking locks and fences, and trying not to nod off from boredom. That night felt normal at first, though the breeze carried a sharp edge like a storm wasn't far off. Overhead, the moon was a pale half-circle, cutting through drifting clouds. I remember thinking how quiet the place felt all of a sudden, the machines looming in the shadows like rusted skeletons. My boots echoed off the metal siding of the empty sheds, and a thin film of sweat made my shirt stick to my back. I kept humming old country tunes under my breath just to keep from feeling so alone. I've never been the type to believe in ghost stories, even though my granddaddy used to swear he'd seen strange lights moving through these same woods when he worked the night trains. Me, I've always figured there's usually a good explanation for most things, and the rest is folks letting their imaginations get the better of them. I'm 38, single, no kids, and the quiet suits me just fine. Nights at the lumber yard were steady pay, and I liked knowing the rhythms of the place, the smell of cut wood, the creaks and moans of the old buildings settling. I carried a thermos of black coffee and a battered paperback to kill the hours between rounds. Still, that night something felt different, like the shadows were watching me as much as I was watching them. My dog, Boone, stayed home those shifts, but for the first time I wished I'd brought him along. There's a certain emptiness in an industrial yard after dark, the kind that can trick your senses into hearing footsteps that aren't yours. About halfway through my second round, I rounded the far corner by the stacked lumber piles and froze, because there was a low, rhythmic scraping coming from the brush just beyond the fence. At first I thought it might be a possum or armadillo nosing around, but the sound was too steady, too measured, like claws dragging across wood. I shined my flashlight over the fence and caught a glimpse of eyes shining back at me, bright yellow and set far apart, higher off the ground than I'd expect for any normal critter. Whatever it was stayed hidden behind palmetto fronds, shifting side to side, so the leaves shivered like someone shaking a rug. The smell that hit me was strong and sour, like wet fur left out in the sun, and it rolled over the fence, so heavy it almost made me gag. I called out a cautious, "Hey there!" But it didn't flinch or run. Instead, the scraping stopped and turned into a low, vibrating growl that made my ribs feel like they were rattling inside me. I kept the beam steady, half expecting to see some mangy dog, but the eyes dropped lower as if it was crouching down, waiting for something. Then, all at once, It lunged forward enough for the light to catch a long snout, spotted fur, and pointed ears, and I realized I was staring at a huge coyote, bigger than any I'd ever seen in these parts. My heart was hammering so hard, it blurred the edges of my vision, and I backed away, my boots crunching gravel so loud it felt like gunshots. But even as I stepped back, the coyote froze mid-step, staring me down, muscles tensed, as if it might spring over the fence. I blinked, and in that split second, it disappeared into the undergrowth, not even leaving the brush swaying in its wake. The strange part was that the scraping sound kept going for a few moments longer, almost metallic now, though I couldn't see what could be making it. The shadows seemed thicker, pressing close around the pools of my flashlight. My breath felt shallow, and the silence returned so sudden it made my ears ring. I swallowed hard, deciding there was no paycheck worth sticking around to investigate that noise. I told the boss the next day that a big coyote was sniffing around, but left out how I'd felt certain, for one terrifying moment, that something bigger than any animal I knew was stalking me in that yard. Folks laugh it off and say it's just the woods playing tricks on tired minds. But I know what I saw, or thought I saw. And sometimes I wake up sweating. Sure, I hear claws dragging across my trailer floor. Nights are long in Alabama, and there's plenty of room out there for things we haven't named yet, or creatures just clever enough to keep hidden from us. Now every time I walk that fence line, I catch myself looking into the trees, half waiting for those yellow eyes to come shining out of the dark. I reckon it was just a big coyote, but a small part of me wonders if that wasn't the whole truth. And this is just the beginning. What comes next still keeps me awake at night. It was late October, deep in the Conecuh National Forest, when I went camping alone for the first time in years, trying to shake off some stress after my job at the feed store had me working double shifts for weeks on end. The nights were crisp, and the leaves crackled underfoot, a welcome break from Alabama's summer humidity. And I'd picked a secluded spot beside a narrow creek where the water ran over smooth stones. I'm 49, widowed, with grown kids who live hours away. So quiet nights in the woods bring me comfort more than fear. I pitched my small canvas tent beneath a stand of towering pines, their trunks dark silhouettes against a rising hunter's moon that silvered every branch and leaf. The air smelled of cold earth and pine sap, and somewhere an owl called softly, its notes carrying far in the stillness. I built a modest fire, its glow pushing back the darkness just enough to keep the forest from feeling like it was closing in. Sparks popped and spiraled upward like tiny comets, and the creek babbled steadily behind me, a soft, reassuring sound. For a while, it felt like the perfect night to clear my mind and breathe. I've always loved the forest, ever since my daddy used to take me squirrel hunting when I was a boy, teaching me how to walk quiet and read signs in the dirt. These days, I'm not much for shooting anything, but I still enjoy the peace of being far from highways and cell service. My friends think I'm half crazy for camping alone, but sometimes it's the only way I can quiet the noise in my head. I'd been drinking a little instant coffee, wrapped up in my flannel coat, just watching the stars wheel overhead, when I started to notice that the crickets had fallen silent. One moment, the woods were singing with their usual nighttime chorus, and the next, it was like a blanket had dropped over every sound except the creek. I felt my skin tighten, the way it does when you sense eyes on you, even if you can't see who's looking. I turned my head slowly, scanning the tree line, telling myself it was just a deer moving through. But the shadows between the pines seemed thicker somehow, like they were holding their breath. Then I heard a rustling on the far side of the creek, heavy enough to snap deadfall and scatter pebbles into the water. My first thought was wild hogs. They roam all through the forest down here. But there was a strange rhythm to the sound, like something was deliberately pacing back and forth. I eased closer to the fire, trying to keep my silhouette low, and listened as branches cracked, louder each time, until it seemed whatever was there was standing right at the edge of the water. I could just make out the glint of eyes, pale green and staring straight at me, reflecting the flicker of my campfire. A sharp, almost metallic scent wafted across the creek, mixing with the smell of wet leaves, and my stomach flipped. I whispered, "Hello?" But the eyes didn't blink, just swayed a few inches side to side. The thing breathed out a low, rasping hiss that made me think of a big cat, but the noise seemed too deep, vibrating the ground under my boots. The fire crackled behind me as I strained to see more than those unblinking eyes. A few seconds later, it stepped forward into the moonlight, enough for me to see a sleek, muscled body, mottled with spots and bars like a bobcat, but easily twice as large as any I'd ever laid eyes on. I let out a quiet curse under my breath, feeling torn between fascination and dread, because it stood so still, watching me as if weighing its options. The creature flexed its paws over the stones, claws clicking faintly, and the pupils of its eyes widened until they were near black. I wanted to believe it was just an oversized bobcat, but something about its size and the way it held itself made it feel almost wrong, like it didn't quite belong here. Then it turned its head sharply, as if hearing something behind it, and in the blink of an eye, it melted back into the darkness, leaving only the rustle of brush and the slow return of cricket song. My breath came back all at once, sharp and ragged, and I realized I'd been holding it the entire time. The firelight seemed to flicker weaker after it left, as though the woods themselves were still recovering from its presence. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my hatchet tight, half convinced it would come back, or that something bigger was waiting in the trees. In the daylight, I crossed the creek to check for tracks, and found faint prints the size of a man's palm, but too round for a cougar, too large for a bobcat, and spaced like the thing had moved low and silently. Folks tell me it was probably just a big bobcat passing through, but the way it watched me, like it understood I was alone, still raises the hair on my arms whenever I think about it. Nature doesn't owe us any explanations, and sometimes I reckon it's better that way. I've camped plenty since then, but never in that same spot, and I keep my fire burning a little brighter these days. This was nothing compared to the next tale. Some folks say it'll give you chills. People around these parts say the Alabama Night speaks if you're willing to listen, and I found that out one spring night while running my trot lines on the Alabama River near Claiborne. The river was wide and black under a sliver of moon, sliding past cypress knees and drowned logs that stuck out of the water like crooked fingers. I'm 52, run a small bait shop in town, and spend more nights than days on that river. So the sounds of water and frogs have always felt like home to me. My John boat drifted slow in the current, lantern light flickering off ripples, while mosquitoes whined around my ears like tiny saw blades. A whip-poor-will called somewhere deep in the trees, and the smell of wet mud hung heavy in the damp air. I was pulling in my lines, checking for catfish, and humming an old gospel tune to keep myself company. Usually the only thing that spooks me out there is the thought of cottonmouths slipping aboard, but that night felt off. Like the river was carrying secrets it didn't want me to hear. I live alone since my sister moved up to Birmingham, and though some folks might call it lonely, I've always preferred my own company and the quiet rhythm of fishing. My days start before dawn, getting bait ready and chatting with the regulars who stop in for minnows or tackle. Nights are my time to breathe, especially out on the river where it feels like the rest of the world disappears. I've seen plenty of strange things in my years. Lights bobbing in the trees, shapes moving along the bank, but nothing I couldn't chalk up to wildlife or a trick of the eyes. That's what I kept telling myself as I moved to the next line. But the breeze turned cold, and the frogs fell silent so sudden it made me look up sharp. My lantern seemed dimmer than before, shadows thickening in the water as if something was swimming just beneath the surface. I paused, my hands gripping the wet nylon line, ears straining for any splash or ripple that might explain the sudden hush. Then I heard it. A scraping, dragging noise coming from the dense reeds along the riverbank, like claws pulling across wood. My first thought was a big gator, though I'd never heard one move quite like that, almost methodical, not the thrashing sound they usually make. I swung my lantern toward the noise, and that's when I caught a glimpse of two red eyes reflecting back at me, set low but far apart, just above the waterline. Whatever it was seemed to sway left and right, pushing reeds aside with slow, deliberate force. A strong, musky odor wafted over the river, mixing with the smell of mud and rotting leaves, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I called out a cautious, "Hey now!" But the only answer was another long scrape, closer this time, like something was inching forward on purpose. The lantern light glimmered off slick scales or fur, I couldn't tell which, and the shape stayed half hidden, refusing to show itself fully. My chest felt tight, and I tasted copper on my tongue, like fear itself. A second later, the thing lunged forward enough for me to catch the outline of a large otter, though its body looked thicker and longer than any river otter I'd ever seen. It stared at me with those red reflecting eyes, water dripping off its whiskers as it bobbed its head side to side, huffing through flared nostrils. For a moment it seemed curious, almost playful. Then it dipped under with barely a ripple, leaving only the reeds swaying and a few bubbles popping at the surface. The scraping sound continued for a moment, even after the otter vanished, echoing off the cypress trunks like metal on wood. My lantern guttered low, and the silence that followed felt deep enough to drown in. I found myself backing away instinctively, trying not to rock the boat, my skin prickling like 100 ants were crawling up my arms. I stared at the river, half waiting for it to rise up and swallow me whole. The shadows seemed to thicken, pressing closer around the edges of the light. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing but a giant otter, or maybe two tangled together, though part of me still wonders if something else was hidden in those reeds, using the otter as cover. Folks at the bait shop laugh when I mention red eyes glinting above the water, saying I must have been half asleep or too deep in my own stories. But every time I drift past that same bend in the river, I feel those eyes on me, waiting just beneath the surface, as if daring me to look closer. Some nights, when the river's dead calm, I swear I can hear that scraping again, even over the sound of my outboard motor. I've fished that river for decades, but now I keep my lantern burning brighter and my ears sharper than ever. I reckon nature still has plenty of mysteries left for folks like me. If you thought this was intense, wait until you hear the next story. It's unbelievable. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I went out before dawn to check the fences on my small cattle farm near Andalusia, figuring I'd get it done before the Alabama sun got high enough to bake my skin. The grass was slick with dew and the fog hung low over the pastures, so thick it seemed to swallow the fence lines whole. I'm 61, been working this land since I was 16. And there's not much that rattles me anymore. But something about the silence that morning felt off, like the land was holding its breath. My boots squished through damp clay as I followed the fence line, counting fence posts like I always do. Birds usually start up a racket at first light, but that morning they stayed hidden, leaving only the creak of the gate hinges and the distant bellow of one restless cow. A faint smell of iron and wet grass lingered in the cool air, mixing with the scent of cowhide and soil. The sun was just a pale glow behind the fog, turning everything a washed-out silver. For a few minutes I stood there listening, unsure what exactly I was listening for. My breath puffed little clouds that vanished into the white. I'm a widower these past 8 years, and though folks think living alone way out here would feel lonely, the truth is I've always been more comfortable in the quiet than in a crowd. My days revolve around the rhythms of the farm, feedings, repairs, tending to the herd, and I find comfort in knowing every path, every sound this land makes. My daughter calls every Sunday to make sure I'm still kicking, but otherwise it's just me, the cows, and the open sky. I've seen my share of bobcats, coyotes, even the occasional black bear wandering through. But they're creatures I respect, not fear. That's what I kept telling myself as I reached the far side of the pasture, where the fence disappears into a thick stand of sweet gum and pine. But the fog seemed heavier there, curling low around the tree trunks like it didn't want me to see what lay beyond. I paused, squinting into the pale grayness, and felt the hair on my arms lift as if an electric current was humming through the ground. Then I heard a low snort, not 10 yards ahead, followed by a rustling so forceful it sent droplets of dew shaking off the leaves. I leaned forward, trying to make out the shape, thinking maybe one of my cows had gotten loose into the woods. That's when I saw 2 amber eyes glowing just above the fog line, wide-set and flickering, as though catching bits of hidden light. The shape behind them shifted slowly, revealing a pair of short-curved horns and a massive bulk that seemed too broad for any white-tailed deer I'd ever seen. The animal let out another snort, blowing a cloud of white vapor into the fog, and I caught the strong, sour scent of wet fur and earth. My heart started pounding as the creature took one heavy step forward, breaking twigs like matchsticks under its weight. For a moment I could have sworn it was an elk, though I knew there hadn't been elk in these parts for decades. It stood half-hidden by the trees, its breath hissing like steam, refusing to come all the way into view. A few seconds later it shifted again, and I caught sight of a thick muscled shoulder covered in dark, shaggy fur, and a glint of something wet sliding down one of the horns. My chest squeezed tight, torn between fascination and a primal urge to run, because everything about the animal seemed just a little too big, too silent, too deliberate. Then, as I tried to step closer, it turned its head sharply, stared straight at me for a long beat, and slipped backward into the fog as if it had melted into the trees. The sound of snapping branches echoed for a moment, then nothing but the distant call of a crow overhead. The silence returned, even deeper than before, and the fog seemed to thin just enough for daylight to creep back in. My breath felt sharp in my throat as I stood rooted, scanning for movement, half wishing I'd imagined the entire thing. But the smell of musky fur still hung in the air, stubborn proof that something had been there. When I checked the ground afterward, I found deep hoofprints in the mud, bigger than any deer tracks I'd ever seen, and spaced too wide for cattle. Folks laugh and say it was probably just a stray bull or my eyes playing tricks in the fog, but I've raised cattle my whole life and never seen any bull move like that or slip away so silently. Part of me wonders if there's still a few wild creatures roaming these woods that the old-timers used to talk about. Animals that know how to keep hidden when they don't want to be found. I've worked this land long enough to know that sometimes the strangest things happen right under our noses. Now I keep a closer watch on the tree line, especially on foggy mornings, and carry my lantern even in daylight. That was just the beginning. You won't believe what happened next. My name's Ruth. I've lived alone in these Alabama woods since my husband passed away 5 years back. And it was one chilly November night when I learned there are sounds in the dark that don't fit any animal I know. The moon was a thin crescent, hanging low and gold above the treetops, and the wind rattled dry oak leaves across my tin roof like claws. I'd been inside knitting by the fireplace, listening to the wood pop and spark, when I realized my old hound, Jasper, was staring at the back door, ears stiff, nose twitching like he'd caught a scent he didn't like. The clock said near midnight, but I decided to step outside and see if a possum or raccoon was prowling around the chicken coop. The night air hit me sharp and cold, smelling of damp moss and smoke from nearby burn piles. All around my cabin stretched dense loblolly pines and underbrush, thick enough to swallow a grown man whole. My breath floated like pale ribbons in the dark as I clicked on my flashlight. The silence felt wrong, almost sticky, like it was pressing close against my skin. I'm 64, a retired school teacher, and though I live alone, I've never been one to spook easy. The woods have always been my comfort, the place I turn when grief or loneliness threatens to swallow me. My days are full with small routines, feeding the hens, tending my vegetable patch, reading old mystery novels by lamplight. Folks around town know me as the lady who bakes pies for every church potluck, and I like it that way. But sometimes, especially late at night, these woods remind me how little we truly see of what shares this land with us. Jasper's growl rumbled low in his chest as I stepped off the porch, sweeping the flashlight over patches of pine needles and scattered leaves. The wind stilled all at once, leaving me with the distant drip of water falling off branches. My heart thumped a little faster than I'd admit, and I kept telling myself it was just a fox or armadillo making a fuss. Then, from the shadows behind the chicken coop, came a rustling so strong it rocked the wire fencing, and I nearly dropped the flashlight. I aimed the beam toward the sound and caught the glint of eyes reflecting back at me, wide set and shining a pale blue, far brighter than any raccoon or fox I'd ever seen. The creature was tall enough that its eyes were well above the height of the coop door, swaying gently side to side as though sniffing the air. A sharp, almost peppery smell wafted across the yard, mixing with the damp scent of pine and earth. My throat felt tight as I tried to call out, "Who's there?" But the words came out thin and shaky. Jasper barked once, deep and loud, and the thing froze, lowering itself a few inches as if ready to spring. I could hear a faint clicking sound, like claws or maybe teeth, though I couldn't see more than the eyes and the shifting shadow behind the wire mesh. Seconds later, it moved forward, just enough for the light to catch glossy fur, patterned in silver streaks across a dark body, and I realized I was staring at a large, gray fox, though its shoulders seemed broader and its movements slower, almost deliberate. Its eyes locked on mine, pupils wide and black, and for a heartbeat it felt like it was studying me instead of simply deciding whether to run. Then it dropped low and darted sideways into the brush, so swiftly the leaves barely rustled in its wake. The wire fence wobbled once more and settled. My breath gusted out in a shaky cloud, and I stumbled back a step, blinking into the dark, trying to see if it might reappear. The peppery scent lingered, and the silence came crashing back around me like thick velvet curtains. I switched off my flashlight, partly because I couldn't stand the idea of seeing those eyes again, shining out from the dark like tiny lanterns. The next morning I checked around the coop and found paw prints smaller than a dog's, but spaced too wide for any ordinary fox. Folks in town laugh and say I probably just caught a glimpse of a big gray fox hunting mice, but I've lived here long enough to know the usual wildlife. and nothing about the way that animal moved felt normal. There are places in these woods where even the bravest hunter won't tread after dark. And I wonder sometimes what's watching us from the shadows, waiting for us to let our guard down. I've kept Jasper closer ever since, and always carry my flashlight, even just stepping onto the porch. Some things we see out here are better left unexplained. This is nothing compared to what's coming up. Last winter, up in the hills north of Tuscaloosa, I was driving my logging truck back toward town after a long haul, and it was along that winding stretch of Highway 43 that I came face to face with something I still can't fully explain. The sky was a deep slate gray, threatening snow that never quite came, and the pine woods on either side of the road were dark as a cave. I'm 57, been hauling timber for 30 years, and I've seen deer, bears, and even the odd panther folks swear don't exist here, but nothing quite like this. The road was slick from frozen drizzle, the headlights throwing white glints off every wet branch, and the CB radio crackled now and again with static. My heater rattled inside the cab, mixing with the drone of the tires. I was dead tired, eager to reach the truck stop for hot coffee and a slice of pie. It felt like any other late shift, until I rounded a bend near an old gravel turnout and saw what looked like a figure crouched in the road. I eased off the gas, thinking it was a man, but the shape didn't move like a person at all. I'm divorced, no kids, and used to long, lonely miles on empty roads, where your own headlights feel like the only light left in the world. Some nights, the only thing keeping me awake is counting the mile markers and singing old Hank Williams tunes to myself. I've heard plenty of stories from other drivers about strange things spotted in these woods, but I've always chalked most of it up to fatigue and imagination. Still, that night, my gut started tightening as I coasted closer to the thing in the road. Its shape was low and bunched, like an animal ready to spring, but the shoulders seemed too square, too tall, and there was a pale stripe running along its back that almost glowed in the beams of my headlights. A shiver worked its way up my spine, and I found myself gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. It didn't move an inch, just sat there like it was waiting for me to get closer. About 50 feet out, my brights hit it fully, and I realized I was staring at a huge badger, though it was nearly the size of a small hog, with fur bristled so high it looked twice its normal height. Its eyes glowed an eerie green, and its long claws were sunk into the frozen blacktop, scraping tiny white lines across the surface. For a second, it lifted its head and stared right at me, as though deciding whether to charge or flee. Its breath puffed out in cloudy bursts, and I noticed a sharp, musky scent flooding into my cab, even through the closed windows. The badger let out a low, guttural hiss, a sound deeper and more menacing than any growl I'd heard from such a critter. Part of me wanted to slam the truck into reverse, but I stayed put, frozen with equal parts fear and curiosity. The shadows from the trees leaned across the road, twisting and shuddering in the headlights. Then, in a sudden blur of movement, it bolted sideways off the asphalt and disappeared into the ditch, leaving only the lingering hiss echoing through the trees. I kept staring at the empty road, half expecting it to leap back out again. The musky smell hung heavy inside the cab, like wet fur and bitter earth. I rolled forward slowly, scanning the shoulders for any sign of movement, but the woods had swallowed the creature whole. As I passed the spot where it had crouched, I saw deep claw marks gouged into the icy pavement, like a knife dragged through butter. My breath fogged the glass as I muttered curses under my breath, my heart slamming so hard it made my chest ache. It was the first time in all my years behind the wheel that I truly questioned whether I'd seen an ordinary animal or something else that shouldn't have been there. I drove on, eyes flicking to my mirrors, half worried it might be following me. Next day at the truck stop, I told a couple of the other drivers, and they laughed and said maybe I'd seen a wolverine, though none of us had ever heard of one living this far south. I've run that same stretch of highway dozens of times since. But I always slow down near that bend, scanning for glowing green eyes just beyond the tree line. People say the woods play tricks on tired minds, and maybe they're right. But I can still hear that hiss sometimes when the wind's up and the road's empty. I've hauled timber through storms, floods, and black ice, but I've never felt as uneasy as I did that night outside Tuscaloosa. There's plenty out here in Alabama's backwoods we don't have names for yet, and that thought keeps me both wary and curious. This was nothing compared to the next tale. Some folks say it'll give you chills. People in these parts always warn you not to wander near swamps after dark, and one humid June evening down in Baldwin County, I finally learned why. I'd been working all day clearing brush around my cousin's hunting cabin, sweat dripping off me like rain, and by the time I packed up my tools, the sun was nothing but a red glow bleeding into the treetops. I'm 46, a mechanic by trade, and I've been stomping around Alabama woods since I was knee-high. But that night felt different from the start. The cicadas fell quiet as I loaded my chainsaw into the truck, leaving only the distant glug of water shifting through the reeds. Mist rolled low across the ground, hugging the cypress knees like a white sheet. The smell of damp earth and stagnant water curled around me, heavy enough to taste. Fireflies blinked like tiny lanterns, casting flickers of green and gold. The swamp seemed alive, like it was watching me pack my things. I stood there a moment, wiping my brow, uneasy for no reason I could name. I'm not married, no kids, and though folks call me a bit of a loner, I've always found comfort in the hush of the woods. My days are filled with grease-stained hands and busted carburetors, so evenings under the pines feel like a reward. Usually, I don't give the swamp much thought beyond keeping an eye out for snakes or gators. But as the last light faded, I noticed the water behind the cabin rippling in perfect circles, like something big was gliding just under the surface. I frowned, thinking maybe a big gar was rolling through, but there was no splash, no thrash, just a steady, silent wake. My skin prickled as I watched the dark water smooth itself over again. I decided to check it out, telling myself it was probably nothing more than a curious beaver. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and crept closer to the water's edge, stepping around roots and soggy patches of ground. When I reached the bank, I spotted two amber eyes staring back at me from just above the water, wide-set and shining like polished marbles. They stayed fixed on me, never blinking, as the creature drifted closer without making so much as a ripple. A sour, fishy smell wafted up as the shape emerged, sleek, low to the water, with a body glinting like wet leather. My first thought was a big otter, but the size was all wrong. It was longer, thicker, almost serpentine. I stood frozen, one boot half sinking in the mud, as the animal hovered there, its eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight. The thing hissed softly, a sound almost like steam leaking from a pipe, and I swear the reeds behind it shivered as if something else moved through them. My breath hung tight in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, heart hammering so loud it seemed to echo across the water. Suddenly the creature surged forward, enough for me to see a broad head, whiskered muzzle, and dark fur streaked with pale markings running along its spine. It was a massive river otter, but larger than any I'd ever heard of around here, and for a moment it seemed almost wrong, like it was testing whether I'd run or stay. Then, in one graceful swoop, It flipped its tail and dove under, sending ripples racing out across the swamp. The water swallowed it whole, leaving nothing but the faint scent of fish and mud. I backed away slowly, scanning the reeds for any other movement, half afraid something bigger was waiting just beneath the surface. The fireflies had gone out, leaving the swamp darker than before. I stumbled back toward my truck, flashlight shaking in my grip, determined not to look over my shoulder. The silence pressed in like wet cotton as I slammed the door shut behind me. Folks say I probably just saw a big otter, but the way it stared me down, and the hush that followed, still makes me wonder what else shares those black waters. I've been back to that cabin since, but I stay away from the water's edge after dark, no matter how many times I tell myself it was nothing out of the ordinary. Nature's got plenty of corners left unexplored, and sometimes I think we're better off letting certain mysteries stay hidden. Thanks so much for sticking with me through these stories from deep in Alabama's woods. If you enjoyed these tales, I'd be grateful if you'd hit the like button, check out the other videos on the channel, and consider subscribing for more real-life stories from the wild places folks don't often talk about. Stay safe out there and keep your eyes open. Sometimes the forest is watching us right back.